Good and gracious God, for the countless gifts of love, we give you thanks. For cool mornings and rumbling afternoons, thunderstorms, for amazing days and even more ordinary evenings, friendships and shallow wading pools. Thanks to you. For the laughing God who tickles us with joy, for the brokenhearted love who joins in our struggles. For the bread of heaven who feeds us hope, for the Spirit of grace who teaches us to dance, we give thanks to God in every time and place. Grace, mercy, and peace to you from the triune God, Creator, Redeemer, and Holy Wisdom. Amen. So on the first day of Vacation Bible School, Monday night, we learned that God's love is always with us. Whenever we are hungry for companionship, spiritual grounding, or growth, or our tummies are actually growling, hungry for food, we learned that God will always provide. The children learned the word manna. What is this stuff? That described the sweet, flaky bread that rained down every day of the week from heaven for 4 decades. Every day except for Sunday, because the previous day had been provided enough food for the Sabbath. The children were especially delighted with the word manna, as I've mentioned. And roughly the English translation is, oh, come on, the kids did better than that. Exactly. So this is a lesson in manna. It comes to us in the form of Grandma Edna's bread recipe. As a young child, I think I've mentioned before that I lived with my grandparents for a number of years before my parents bought their own home and we moved on in the same town. But I remember as a young girl, early in the morning, way earlier than I even like to think about now, I would go down into my grandmother's kitchen, which was approximately the size of this table, and she would be starting her daily bread baking. And I remember up on the wall of this tiny little kitchen, this picture that you all have probably seen. It's a man who is elderly, like, my age, and he's bent over with his hands folded against his forehead. In the foreground is a loaf of bread out of which one slice has been cut. There's a simple bowl, a Bible, and his glasses are sitting right on top of that Bible. And he is praying about as devotedly as anyone could possibly pray in this lifetime. I remember that picture as if I were looking at it right there. And I remember thinking, even as a young child, what wisdom that man must have. And then I would look over at my sweet, adorable Grandma Edna, and I would think the very same thing. What wisdom. She would be busy putting together the elements of bread that I'm going to be doing in front of you here now. And unlike Grandma Edna, I've got a little recipe here just to make sure I do it right. But Grandma Edna had this wisdom that surpassed all understanding. She had been baking bread for her family for so many years, even though I think she was younger than I was at the time, or at least younger than I am right now. She had been baking so many loaves of so much bread for her family that she didn't need a recipe. She just knew. Humanity has been making bread for something like 30,000 years. Back during the Stone Age is when they first started thinking about bread. Archaeologists argue early population growth would never, ever have been possible without the invention of this thing we call bread. It has been used as currency in antiquity, and it is often found preserved in tombs of ancient Egyptians as a gift for those who are to receive you in the afterlife and to provide food for you on that journey. It was such an important element that the Hebrew word for bread, which is lehem, means both bread and food. Bread is such a simple food, but every ingredient has its role. Every ingredient has its talent, just like each one of us sitting here in this room has our talent. The kids in Vacation Bible School learned that Chris Weiss's special talent was singing and playing guitar. They learned that Nancy Matias's special talent was making food for hordes of hungry children. Maddie's special talent was putting together these amazing science projects. If I'm not mistaken, there are pieces of bread down in the fellowship hall that are hopefully molding, and I've been instructed to throw them away. In bread, there is yeast. It's a fungus, and it is used in doughs. When it is mixed with water, in this case warm water, and mixed up, there is a foaming action that starts the process of fermentation. It helps if, and here's where my bread making skills get a little dicey, it helps if you add a little sugar. About a tablespoon, right? Maybe. That foaming action soon. These bubbles lighten up the bread dough and make bubbles in the bread dough that cause the bread to rise and become chewy and soft. And once the bread is baked, the bubbles are set, and the bread becomes a spongy texture that we love to eat. Salt gives the bread some taste and brings out the flavor of the flour and the aroma of the other ingredients. Butter helps make the bread tender and not so tough, although bread can be made without a fat. Flour, maybe the most important ingredient, although bread would not be bread without any of these ingredients. Oh, Skipper, I'm sorry. You're gonna have to vacuum when I'm done. Flour provides the supporting structure that makes the thick interior. It is also where we get most of our calories and our nutrition. So let's see what happens. Add the butter. Started. All Holly would be mortified if he watched me do this. Then I'm going to add the water with bubbling. Oops, there's a little clump in there. With the yeast that is starting to bubble. If we had more time, I would wait just a smidge to put the yeast and the water in, but here we go. And then we mix. Bread constituted about half the caloric intake of people in antiquity, as much almost as it does today. Today, about 60% of the world eats some sort of bread every day. It shows up as tortillas and it shows up as naan. If you're Scandinavian, it shows up as pumpernickel. But there's lots of different kinds of bread. The flour that I'm mixing in today is mostly bread flour with a portion of whole wheat flour that gives a few more ingredients. Bread literally gives us life, sacramentally and physically. For most of our history, only rich people had ovens for their homes. And so you would find women gathering at community oven spaces to bake their bread early every morning. I think about these women baking bread for their families every single morning at the communal oven, and I can just imagine the community that they are building, the laughter that they are sharing, the sorrows and the troubles that they are listening to from each other. I can only imagine what that was like for those people. I remember sitting there as my grandmother kneaded the bread, telling her all of my 3-year-old and having Grandma Edna listen quietly and solve almost every one of them. In fact, the word companion, interestingly, comes from the Latin words meaning cum, meaning with, and panis, meaning bread. Literally, companionship is eating bread with one another. There is relationship in being together. And as Christians, we believe, I need a little more power here. As Christians, we know there is relationship and community wherever Jesus resides. And I might say, Jesus is in this loaf of bread that I'm making. We experience divine power through strong and really healthy relationships, and Jesus is the one who merges my life with yours and our lives collectively with God, Creator. This is a fermented food, and as such, it's kind of, those little yeasties are in there just starting to bubble away. The water, if you could touch the bread right now, you would feel that the bread is kind of warm and soft and sweet. I'm kneading the bread, and this is the action that mixes all of the ingredients and produces the gluten. Now, I know some of you are gluten-free, and I really don't understand how anybody can bake without gluten, but that's a growing edge for me. But this develops the gluten, those strings that provide the structure in the loaf. And you can tell that the gluten is starting to develop by this stretching and rolling and stretching and rolling, because when you look at the bread and pull it apart, it starts to spring back. I don't know if you can see that very well, but if I pull it apart, it starts to spring back. And that tells me the gluten is starting to do its thing. Kneading for me is a contemplative activity. When life gets tough, as it often does, I bake bread. I love the repetitive and ordinary, often called quotidian activity of kneading bread. If I'm having a particularly tough day, somebody's name might be kneaded into the bread, or some situation might be kneaded into the bread. Once again, dear God, I don't know what to do, and so I need bread. I need bread, and I need bread. More often than not, insights come to me in the quiet, repetitive motion of making bread. Another thing about bread that just astonishes me is that the ingredients come together, sort of transform. There is no way at this point that I could separate out the yeast, I could separate the water out, and there's no way that I would be able to sprinkle the dough that's in this bread on my baking pad. It is a transformational experience to make a loaf of bread. Come to greater insights about who I am as a person, who I am in this world, and maybe most importantly, I can make myself a story of who I am as a woman of God, who I discover truly who I am. Baking bread is transformational. We're making something new. This is no longer water, flour, yeast, and salt, and a dose of honey. This is bread dough. Something has happened in the last few minutes to this dough. In order to become what they are, and in order to become a loaf of bread, things need to come together to mix and really get to know each other, as they do in this loaf. They are transformed from one thing to another, just as I might suggest we are transformed from what we were into what we are growing to be in the act of Holy Communion, receiving the blessed wine and bread of our God. The quiet, repetitive motion of baking bread creates space in my being. It simply calms my soul. It's been such a contemplative activity in my life. Some of you know that my husband John and my house burned on the McKenzie River a couple of years ago, and it was pretty tragic and pretty traumatic. Every one of my friends got roast bread in the weeks following that fire because I simply needed space to contemplate how my life had changed with everything that we had owned in ashes. Eating bread helps me discover who I am as a child of God, so that I can make myself known to you, my community, and to my family, and to my friends, and the people around me who I love. Baking bread helps me pursue my lifetime desire to grow within my human and non-human family. And that with that, I'm pretty sure that I am becoming equipped glorify God. This process takes time. Mix, work it together, knead it. This loaf will need to rise to about double its size before it will become actual bread ready to bake, but then you bake it. The process takes time. I invite you into that process of contemplation about how much we get from a simple loaf of bread. What a gift. Whether it is bread that we serve with butter and cheese and all the yummy other stuff on our tables, or whether this is bread of life from heaven, the true bread that came down to bless us and love us and give us everlasting life. And with that, all God's children say,